Good evening. My name is John H., and I'm an alcoholic. In this Code Blue Big Book Action Seminar, we're going to go through the recovery section of the Big Book line by line. We are going to take the action that our founders and the first 100 people who recovered say that we must do to overcome this seemingly hopeless condition of mind and body. Now, I don't claim to be any kind of a big book and 12-step guru or expert, not by any means. I am no kind of deep spiritual advisor. I'm just a simple drunk who was almost dead from the disease when a couple of recovered alcoholics reached out their hand to me and said, "We have a different way." Now, this is based on the Canadian method pioneered by the Golden Slippers, but I also borrow heavily from the Joe and Charlie Big Book Weekend tapes, from Chuck C., from Clancy, and from all of the giants upon whose shoulders we are riding. Now, I would love it if you could grab a couple of friends and listen to these sessions together, because working the steps with other people is always more powerful than trying to go through them alone. So you're going to need a large print big book, a highlighter, and a pen, and some willingness. And as you guys will see, we open every session with a set-aside prayer to more open our mind to be more receptive to this information. Thank you so much for listening. Good evening, everybody. I'm John. I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, John.
During the 1950s, a man by the name of Max C., now dead, started a group in Winnipeg, Manitoba called the Golden Slippers. The group was a back to the basics of the big book kind of group, especially for those who could not stay sober for any length of time. The group took a bunch of chronic slippers and walked them through the steps, taking the action exactly as laid out by the first 100 men and women who wrote the basic textbook, Alcoholics Anonymous. This is not your typical thanks for sharing kind of AA meeting, nor is it like any seminar. Participants are asked to do all 12 steps as laid out in our basic textbook. One or more of the people who have done this work before will be guides to lead you through the instructions in our basic textbook using a dictionary published at about the same time as the book Alcoholics Anonymous to help us better understand the directions as they were written by the first 100 men and women. We ask every participant to commit to the entire process. Though we read and study the AA Big Book, this group is not limited to members of AA. We who have participated in these groups before have come to understand that these sessions make us much better sponsors. We can now lead people through the steps exactly as given to us by those who have gone before, unfettered and unchanged. In addition to being a boot camp for sponsors, we also feel this is especially valuable to those who have been through some sort of treatment or rehab and have been, in effect, left off at 3 or 5. Recovery requires that we do all 12 steps. We recover in AA by taking the steps, and if we don't take the action as described in our basic textbook, we may not recover. And I'm going to add, in my 5.5 years, I've seen several people die. These study and action sessions will guide you through the steps precisely as the first 100 men and women laid them down. These are back to the basic sessions, accepting the simple kit of spiritual tools that's been laid at our feet. Let's open with the set-aside prayer. God, please let me set aside everything I think I know about sobriety, life, and you, so that I may be open to a new experience. Amen. All right, welcome everybody. We have got a ton to do tonight, so I might be going faster than I usually do. We've got absolutely a lot. We obviously, we're at We Agnostics. So basically what Bill is trying to do is he writes the book, right? He gave us the doctor's opinion, tell us what's wrong with us. He gave us Bill's story, the classic example. He gave us the solution, which is a vital spiritual experience. And then at the end of chapter 3, what we read last week, he tells us what is going to happen to us if we don't accept step 2, if we don't accept the solution. So after reading at the end of chapter 3, I am convinced, they have convinced me that left to my own devices, I will not overcome drinking. That explains my futile attempts, over 20 years in and out of these rooms to overcome the obsession to drink alcohol and how I failed miserably. I now understand why, and that the only way I'm going to recover is if I can get the help of a power greater than myself. Right? So, most of us are going to say, oh my God, crap, we got to get some sort of a God in our life. And a lot of us look for the door when we hear that, right? Bill himself, when we read Bill's story, we saw how Bill thought self-knowledge, knowledge of what was wrong with him would fix it, right? Roland Hazard was the guy who was treated by Carl Jung for a year. And Roland Hazard, once he knew what was wrong with him, he was so confident, he thought self-knowledge would fix it. Fred, the high-bottom drunk, right, who was on top of the world in Washington giving evidence to Congress when he relapsed, he thought self-knowledge would fix it too, right? But all of these guys discovered that wasn't the case. So going back to page 43, right at the bottom of the page, I just want to reread that. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. So they're telling us that we've got to find a power greater than ourselves if we're going to overcome drinking, right? So again, what that means, it means that we cannot heal a sick mind with a sick mind. We try to use our mind to overcome our disease. A sick mind is not going to fix a sick mind. Self-knowledge isn't going to do the job, right? The more we try to think our way out of this, the deeper we get into it. It tells us that our solution must come from a higher power. Our defense against that first drink must come from a higher power, right? So this is one hell of a dilemma. Because I'm convinced after chapter 3 that I've got to have the help of a higher power, God, right? And without that help, I'm going to go back to drinking eventually if I don't get that help. Maybe I'll get 1 month, maybe 2, maybe 3. I think, my all-time record, I almost had a year once. But I'm going to go back to drinking without that higher power. So in my past, I was raised Catholic. And my first memory of I guess, church or religion, if you will, I don't know how old I was, but I was crawling around the pew, and my father grabbed me by the scruff of by the top of my head, lifted me in the air, and slammed me into the pew, right? And that's my first memory of church or religion. And I had some real doozies for priests as I grew up. The early 70s, hellfire, brimstone, damnation, right? I did have a few priests that talked about a loving God, but whenever they brought a priest like that in, the congregation would vote him out. And they'd bring back the other guy that told us what lousy sinners we were and that we were going to go to hell, right? So I found this. Everybody sees this little dollar bill that I have in my book. So I found this. I was on the way out to the retreat to do a step 1 with some people in treatment, and I found this on a gas pump about a year ago. So this is what, if I can read it, man, it's small. This is what it says. The $1 million question. Will you go to heaven when you die? Here's a quick test. Have you ever told a lie, stolen anything, or used God's name in vain? Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Have you looked with lust? Will you be guilty on Judgment Day? If you have done those things, God sees you as a lying, thieving, blasphemous adulterer at heart, right? So, and it goes on. But a lot of people that come in here have, maybe not this extreme, but they have ideas about God that are going to prevent them from seeking help from a higher power, right? And when I read that dollar bill, I've been doing all of those things and worse. My whole life I've been defying God, right? So I'm thinking God isn't going to help me based on the God that I know, right? And I've always believed in some sort of God, right? But certainly never a God who could affect my life here and now, right? At least not positively. And, even if I did believe in God, a God running everything, the way I run my life, I run it as if I run everything, right? So Bill thought, as he's writing this book, sooner or later, I'm going to have to ask these people to make a decision about God, right? And there's a lot of people. There was a guy a couple meetings back at Saturday night that said, you can't talk about God at the podium, right? And I'm just listening to him, and I'm like, well, of course you can. That's what this whole program is about. But he was really anti-God, right? So Bill thought many people are not going to be able to ask God for help based upon their old ideas. So Bill, he's thinking that I need to give them new information about God. Hopefully they can disregard some of their old ideas about God, right? The ones I learned from the hellfire and brimstone priests, and maybe pick up some new ideas about God. So as I read We Agnostics, I discovered that many of my old ideas, my old prejudices about God were possibly wrong, and all screwed up. And I kind of discovered that if I could discard some of them and pick up some new ideas, maybe I could make a decision based on God, right? Based on these new ideas, right? Because the book's telling me I need the power of a higher power of God in my life to overcome my addiction to alcohol, drugs, and gambling. Dr. Jung, right? Dr. Jung told Roland Hazard, the guy he treated for a year, that ideas, attitudes, and emotions, when he was talking about the spiritual experience, he said ideas, attitudes, and emotions, which were once the guiding force in the lives of these hopeless alcoholics, were suddenly cast aside, and new ideas, attitudes, and emotions took their place, right? And that's how people could recover before this program. And he also said that was just here and there, now and then, once in a while, right? Very rarely did this ever happen. You have a better chance of being hit by lightning, right? So, and he talked about the agnostic. Agnostic simply means, Gnostic means knowledge, and ag means without. So the agnostic simply means without knowledge. And Bill said in Bill's story, when they talked of a God personal to me, he said, my mind snapped shut. Right? Remember in Bill's story, he said, I was aghast. He didn't want to hear any of that God crap, right? This chapter, We Agnostics, is put here that I might read, question, and wonder and get some new ideas about God, right? It doesn't tell me how to believe at all. It does not tell me how to believe. It just tells me to keep an open mind and stop being such a contemptuous about everything. So, based on that, let's take a look. We're going to go to page 44. Let me stash my dollar bill somewhere for next time. Okay, so right at the top of the page here, so we're going to write a few things. Let's write chapter devoted to step 2. We can write that right above chapter 4. Chapter devoted to step 2. Agnostics are unsure. Atheists don't believe. And again, we got so much to cover tonight that if I go fast, you can always get onto YouTube and type in Code Blue Big Book, and you can catch up any notes that you missed. Chapter devoted to step 2, agnostics are unsure, atheists don't believe. And then right next to chapter 4, write tools to diagnose yourself. Right? And then under that, 2 questions. So they're going to give us tools to diagnose yourself. And they're going to give us the 2 questions to do that. So, chapter devoted to step 2, agnostics are unsure, atheists don't believe, tools to diagnose yourself, 2 questions. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. Okay, so we're going to highlight to the end of the paragraph. And we're going to put a 1 in front of if. That's the first of the 2 questions. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, okay, or put a 2 in front of the next if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only, circle only, a spiritual experience will conquer. So, back in the day, I think they started out with 10 questions if you're an alcoholic. Then they had 20 questions, and I'm not even sure. It's been a while since I've been in treatment, but maybe they're up to 44 questions now, right? Things like, does alcohol affect your reputation? Does alcohol affect your sex life? Now, I got to tell you, the last couple of years of my using, there was certainly none of that. One of the other questions is, do you drink alone? What kind of question is that? Do you drink alone? If I'm buying yes, if you're buying no, right? We only need these two questions. So what they mean, okay, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, that means can you quit entirely on your own resources? I quit drinking at least 1,000 times, maybe 2,000 times, and I couldn't do it, right? So can you quit entirely on your own resources? And I even did it. I went to a lot of meetings and I got more time, but I still couldn't do it. The second question, if when drinking you find you cannot quit entirely, if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, that means, do you have any control over the amount you drink once you start drinking, right? These are two simple questions, and they're going to tell you if you're an alcoholic, right? And it goes on, it says, if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer, right? We are a unique people, we alcoholics. We are among the few, the roughly 10%, who suffer from a twofold illness. Remember, the allergy of the body, we once we start, we can't stop, and the obsession of the mind. When we quit for good, we can't stay stopped. So we suffer from a twofold illness that can only be overcome by a spiritual experience. This is also a terminal disease. It's deadly, right? But the good news is we can come out of it in better shape than when we went into it if we are able to have this spiritual experience, right? To one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. Okay, we're going to highlight to the end of the paragraph. To be doomed to an alcoholic death, next to that write step 1. Or to live on a spiritual basis, next to that write step 2, are not always easy alternatives to face. I mean, I think that's one of the funniest things Bill Wilson ever wrote. He said to be doomed to an alcoholic death, that's door number 1, or to live on a spiritual basis, that's door number 2, are not always easy alternatives to face. So some of us choose an alcoholic death, a miserable, horrible death, rather than door number 2, living on a spiritual basis. So next to that, let's write, willing to be spiritual or go die alone. Willing to be spiritual or go die alone. I mean, if you went into a cancer ward and you said, guys, if you do these things and live this way, we've got a 100% recovery rate. But if you don't, you're going to die a horrible death. I'm going to say probably 100% of those cancer patients are going to take door number 2. But we alcoholics, most alcoholics choose the alcoholic death. It's amazing. But it isn't so difficult. About half of our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue. Hoping against hope, we were not true alcoholics, right? That's the first thing. We try to deny it. But after a while, we had to face the fact, highlight, that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Okay, so highlight that little phrase, and right next to it, again, write 2 options. Hope, spirituality, or death. 2 options. Hope and spirituality, or death. They just told us twice in just a few sentences there. That's what our choice is. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. So disconcerted means upset, embarrassed, or worried, right? Because a lot of times when people hear this spirituality thing, they're thinking about how quick they can get out the door, right? And get back to their drinking and more than likely die. So right here, I like to stop with my sponsee and myself, and I like to say, what is my belief? What is my belief as far as this God thing is concerned, right? Let's not be afraid of it or shut it out. Let's look at it, right? So I was taught that today we've got 3 ways to believe, okay? And you don't need to write this, but the first way is an atheist. An atheist believes there is no God, there is no power greater than human power. We're going to stand on our own 2 feet, we're going to run the show ourselves. That's it. Now, I asked myself, am I an atheist, right? And maybe some of you are, but my answer was no, I'm not. Right? The second way that we can believe is agnostic, without knowledge. Right? So these guys and gals always believed in some kind of a God, but never a God that would be existing in our life, right? So we've got no knowledge, just belief, and we've never tried to ask this God for help in our life. So we don't have any knowledge that God can actually help people, right? And the third way to believe is the true believer, right? The true believer knows that God exists and has experienced God's power in their life. Right? So I don't think anybody comes into AA as a true believer. I certainly didn't. So, the question is, how can we become this, get some sort of belief so that we can tap into God's power in our lives, right? And get better. So again, that you remember we did the God is and the God isn't, but the other exercise is, and I'll say this again at the end of the session, is I'm going to want you just to write down some things that you'd like God to be. What if you could design your own God, just a few things, what would you like that God to be, right? In church, I was taught that I've got to believe what they told me to believe, and if I didn't take their narrow pathway of belief, that I was going to go straight to hell, right? But here in the spirituality, we can come up with our own conception of God, right? What would we like it to be, right? Highlight the next 3 lines. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. Okay? So they're telling us that that's not enough. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power, circle that word power, wasn't there. Okay, and then highlight the next sentence. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. So that's quitting on our own willpower. That's our own willpower. So after utterly, let's write, need something stronger than me. Need something stronger than me. I mean, let's face it, guys. We don't end up in AA because we can quit on our own willpower. It doesn't happen. Need something stronger than me. Okay, so we're gonna highlight the next whole little paragraph there. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had, circle had, because that's a must, we had to find a power by which we could live, and it had, circle had, to be a power greater than ourselves. Right? Obviously, but where and how are we to find this power? So we're going to highlight that, and we're also going to highlight the next 3 sentences. Well, that's exactly, and circle that word exactly, what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you, and circle you, because that's you, that's your sponsees, that's right here, right now, to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. Stop highlighting there. Now, it doesn't say you're going to find a power greater than yourself so you can solve your problem. It doesn't say that. It says that you're going to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. So right next to that, we're going to write, must seek higher power. And I don't care what it is. I don't care what your conception about it is. Must seek higher power. And then also, where we wrote, need something stronger than me, right next to that, write 2 or 3 more powerful. They're talking about people, but not always there. So that's why meetings are effective. So need something stronger than me. 2 or 3, and they're talking people, are more powerful, but they're not always there. But that's why meetings are able to work, right? And that's why if we go to, if some people go to 3 meetings a day, maybe they can get through this, because that's the power of the fellowship. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual, above spiritual, write higher power, as well as moral, above moral, write helping people. And then highlight the next little sentence. And it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God. There's that word again. So somewhere in there, I have it off to the left, I wrote, this book is about finding a higher power. This book is about finding a higher power. That's what it just told us. That's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. This book is about finding a higher power. Right? And again, I mean, there's a lot of people say, you can't talk about God. And my sponsor early on, one of my sponsors said, if you talk about God and they leave, they said whiskey's going to drive them right back in here. Right? He said, don't you worry about talking about God. Here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, circle God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. Next to that paragraph, let's write, God scares people, or can scare people, right? And it can be based on their past experiences, but God scares some people, right? Can be scary for the newcomer, right? Because, like, you know, if some people were raised like that dollar bill that I read, and they've been doing all of those things, they don't want to go to this God for help, right? We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God, circle God, brought up a particular idea of him, circle him, with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought, highlight to cowardly, that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. That's what I thought, hiding behind God again, right? We looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance means with disapproval. We looked askance at many individuals who claimed to be godly. Highlight the next two lines. How could a supreme being, and we circle every word Bill uses for a deity, how could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments we found ourselves thinking when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside, highlight to the end of the paragraph, lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. Okay, so let's go back up to that word prejudice. And let's write old ideas. Old ideas. Okay, next to prejudice. And then on the other side of that sentence, where it says willingness, just write all it takes. All it takes. If we're even willing to believe that maybe there's something, that's all it takes to start. Highlight the next 4 lines. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Right? That's why we're not a cult. Right? We're not going on anybody else's beliefs. They're not telling us to believe anything. Right? We did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with him. Stop highlighting there and circle him. It's capitalized. Okay? And next to that, what we just highlighted, right, Ebby, Thatcher, and Bill, go back page 12. So you're going to do that with your sponsee. Ebby, Thatcher, and Bill, go back to page 12. So you guys don't have to go there, but if you remember that Bill and Ebby were arguing back and forth, Ebby was talking about using highly religious terms, and Bill was saying, don't give me that God crap, and they were going back and forth, and Ebby got sick of it, and he said, why don't you choose your own conception of God, right? And that's when it went from a religious message to a spiritual message, because religion says you must believe this way. Spirituality, it doesn't matter how you believe, it simply asks, are you willing to believe? Right? Big difference. Okay, I went back to page 12 and I lost what page we were on.
46.
46, thank you. All right. As soon as we admitted the possible existence, and again, any term for deity we're going to circle, of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe, underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. Circle simple steps, draw a little arrow, and write 3 through 11. Those are the other simple steps. Okay? And we're going to highlight to the end of the page. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek Him. To us, the realm of the Spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. Okay, so next to that, we're going to write what God is. And we're also going to write, this is a promise. There are promises scattered throughout this whole book. Not only the ones that we read at meetings that we get after the 9th step. So what God is, this is a promise. And those who earnestly seek, right? See where that seek is? Circle that word seek, and then write action next to it. Action. Okay? So, at the top of the page, we're going to write belief plus experience equals faith. Right? That's a wonderful definition. Belief plus experience equals faith. You know, and another way that somebody told me is faith is hope with a track record, right? We got some hope, we put that hope to test, and we get results, right? And remember your homework. God is and God isn't. And we start conducting ourselves as if the God is part is real and see what happens. We do a scientific experiment. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean, highlight, your own conception of God. There it is again. Your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you may find in this book. Highlight the next 5 words. Do not let any prejudice. Now remember that what they mean by prejudice is our old ideas. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. Okay, so we're going to highlight the next sentence. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth. Right? So they're asking us, just don't let any old ideas you got deter you from asking yourself if maybe you believe in something, right? Whatever it is, your own definition of it. To affect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Highlight Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which them seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth, but if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. I don't care, whatever it is. You can say God is love, that's enough. And remember, again, Ebby Thatcher, when he 12-step Bill, that's where this whole notion started, with your own conception of God. That's it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead. We're going to highlight the next 6 lines. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, that's the agnostic, or am I even willing to believe, that's the atheist, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say he does believe, the agnostic, or is willing to believe, the atheist, we emphatically assure him he is on his way. Okay, so we're gonna have a little stop here and ask sponsee Do you believe or are you willing? ... So we're going to stop right here and I want you guys to ask yourselves as well. But when you're going through this book with your sponsee, stop here and ask sponsee, do you believe or are you willing? ... Are you willing? Are you even willing to believe that there's something greater than your little thoughts and your little problems, right? Or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. Okay. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure, circle that, spiritual structure, can be built. And the spiritual structure, what Bill is creating in our mind, it's somebody building a big stone arch, which is the spiritual experience through which we get to walk to freedom. So after it can be built, right, page 567. This is the third time they've asked us to go to Appendix 2, right? Please be sure to read Appendix 2 on spiritual experience. Now, we read that when we did There Is a Solution. But again, that's one of the things I'm going to ask you guys to do again when you get home tonight is to reread that. So they're telling us for the third time, because if they want us to have a spiritual experience, they want to make darn sure that we know what a spiritual experience is. So, the spiritual structure is the awakening or the experience, right? It's a stone arch, again, through which we walk to freedom. The foundation stone is step one. Step one is willingness. The cornerstone is belief, which is step 2. So if we can believe that there might be something greater than ourselves, we now have 2 stones in place, right? Yes, we are willing to change, and yes, we believe, or yes, we are willing to believe, right? So a quick little story, right? Let's say that you're new to the area, right? You just moved into Minnetonka, your car breaks down. And you don't know a mechanic, so you go to your neighbor and you say, hey man, do you know a good mechanic? And he says, yeah, go to Jimmy's Auto Service. They'll treat you right, they'll do a good job, and they'll get you a fair price. So we go to Jimmy on belief because we were told about him. So we go there on belief. Jimmy does a good job and he charges us a fair price. So we went there on belief. A year later, something else goes wrong with our car. Now we're going to go back to Jimmy on faith, right? Because belief plus experience equals faith, right? And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that as we go through the chapter. So that's what they're asking us to do with these steps. That was great news to us. For we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith, which seemed difficult to believe. So they're not asking us to have faith. We don't got to have faith right now. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes, but I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. Besides a seeming inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Okay, highlight the next sentence, next 2 lines. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. That was like a guy at the meeting two weeks ago, he got up and railed against God, railed against him, right? So at the top of the page, we're going to write something, unreasoning prejudice, right? So that we're going to write adhering to an opinion despite evidence or in spite of reason. And unfortunately, that's how I live most of my life. Adhering to an opinion despite evidence or in spite of reason. I saw people I partied with come into these rooms and recover and get better, and I still didn't believe it. It was nonsense. Adhering to an opinion despite evidence or in spite of reason, right? This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. Highlight, in this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Just that little bit there. Next to that, we're going to write hitting bottom to get to willingness. Hitting bottom to get to willingness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. And I mean, for me, guys, coming in and out of these rooms for 20 years, I found a tape, and I'm going to get them to clean it up. I found a tape. I was trying to get sober back in around 97, and I made a 7-minute tape after I didn't have a job. I had a 2-week relapse financed on my credit cards, and I got to tell you, man, I somehow had the forewithal to record myself how I felt after that, and I'm going to see if they can clean it up, but it's not pretty. And I went on for about another 14 years after that horrible relapse. So hitting bottom to get to be willingness, and that was because of my prejudice against these ideas. The reader may still ask why he should believe in a power greater than himself. We think there are good reasons. Let us have a look at some of them. By the way, it says that we really got to hit bottom. Dr. Jung, in a letter to Bill Wilson later, he said, and I don't know exactly what it was, but he says, I thought alcoholics drank spirits because they lacked spirituality, right? Spirits being alcohol. We didn't have any spirituality. That's why we needed to drink spirits. Remember when you are at the bottom, you're at rock bottom, and you go into a bar and you down 6 shots of tequila, all of a sudden you're brimming with life again? Right? But you got to keep going, right? And so it goes away. But he said, you guys drank spirits because you wanted spirituality. Now, William James, in his book, Varieties of Religious Experiences, he said there are 2 things. He talked about people who had conversion experiences, right? Where they went from one way to completely change into a different person. He said there were 2 things that most all of these had in common. The first one was that you had to be at rock bottom before you could have that conversion or that awakening. So we got to be at rock bottom, right? And he said the second thing they have in common is that these spiritual experiences or conversions, they're transitory. They don't last. They're transitory. That's why people have the awakening, and guess what? They can go back to drinking. That's why people in the past that didn't have these steps and these principles, and many of them that do have them, they'll have the awakening, they'll be living good, but it's transitory. They go back to their old ways, right? So he said, but we've got a program, and there's 2 things we can do, right? If we're lucky enough to have the spiritual awakening, it's going to tell us that we've got to align ourselves with those who are trying to grow spiritually. That means we got to hang out in these rooms, right? And it also says we also know that we've got to spend the rest of our lives helping people like us. And if we do those 2 things, then it won't be transitory for us. It'll be a permanent for us. But we got to do those 2 things. Beat us into reasonableness. The reader may ask why he should believe in a power greater than himself. We think there are some good reasons. Let's have them look at them. The practical individual of today is a stickler for facts and results. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of a doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it is impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point, right? We flip the switch. We believe that light's coming on. Everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence, but no perfect visual proof. And does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that outward appearances are not inward reality at all. To illustrate, the prosaic steel girder is a mass of electrons whirling around each other at incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws, and these laws hold true throughout the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. Okay, we're going to highlight the next 2, 4, 6 lines. When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an all-powerful guiding creative intelligence, right there our perverse streak comes to the surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. So stop highlighting there and let's write next to that, I won't believe. I won't believe. I ain't going to believe in that. I see the miracle happening in other people's lives. I read the stories in this book, but I see my sponsor who is just like me, but I still don't believe it, right? We read wordy books and indulge in windy arguments thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. Were our contentions true, it would follow, highlight, that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation, highlight to the end of the paragraph, we agnostics and atheists choose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end of all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? So Alpha and Omega won't keep you sober, but first and last letter of the Greek alphabet. All right, the first and the last of it. We're also going to highlight the next two lines. We who have traveled this dubious path beg you to lay aside prejudice even against organized religion, right? Even against organized religion. So they're just saying, lay it aside for just a little bit here and let's look at some things. We have learned that whatever the human frailties of various faiths may be, those faiths have given purpose and direction to millions. Highlight this little sentence. People of faith have a logical idea of what life is all about. It's that little line there. Actually, we used to have no reasonable conception whatever. We used to amuse ourselves by cynically dissecting spiritual beliefs and practices when we might have observed that many spiritually minded persons of all races, colors, and creeds were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness, and usefulness which we should have sought ourselves, right? Instead, we looked at the human defects of these people and sometimes used their shortcomings as a basis of wholesale condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We missed the reality and the beauty of the forest because we were diverted by the ugliness of some of its trees. We never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing, right? So next to that sentence, we're going to write, pointing fingers at others, not look at me. Pointing fingers at others, not look at me.